This is Monica Perez, and we are back with part two of the conclusion of Makers of the Modern Mind. It's we're up to section 3, and it might be a short one. Hopefully, it packs a lot of punch. Thank you for coming. What can be said in summary form of the effect each maker of the modern mind has had on history? How has the world differed because of him? We must remember, of course, that Luther was not the first maker of the modern mind. The mentality upon which he set to work had been in the making ever since the days of Greek antiquity. And fully to account for the way we think and act today, it is necessary to go back to Plato and Aristotle, to work through Zeno and Cicero, through the supreme contribution of the Apostolic Church, the contributions of St. Augustine and perhaps Boethius, down to the great synthesis of St. Thomas in the 13th century. From the Greeks, Western man obtained his logical, rational method of thinking with its faith in the ability of the mind of man to discover truth. From the Romans came an emphasis on law and order, and from Christianity came the strong stress on charity and mercy, on just dealing with one's fellows and with God. From them all came the lofty view of man as a being who is master of all creation, who is Lord of all the universe, but who holds all things in trust from the Lord of all, to whom man is responsible for his human actions. From them all came the concept of natural law as that portion of God's law which man can discover by the right use of his reason, a law which is normative and therefore deals with man as a moral person. The thought of man down till the Renaissance was essentially theocentric. Man was looked upon as a creature of God. He was studied chiefly. Okay, so this is kind of what I want to get to. What is the modern mind, and where so yes, we are bridging the Renaissance to modernity through this, beginning with Luther, is what I've concluded. The thought of man down till the Renaissance was essentially theocentric. Man was looked upon as a creature of God. He was studied chiefly as a member of the human race whose ultimate destiny was clearly known and whose activity on earth was judged in relation to that destiny. Man's sojourn on earth was a time of trial in which, by rightly using his reason and his freedom, he earned his eternal reward. As an individual, see, that's the truth. I mean, that's like the hope. That's the white pill. As an individual, however, man was rather neglected. Certainly, such practical subjects as medicine and physics, chemistry and biology made almost no progress from the days of Galen and Aristotle down till the time of Descartes. This was the mind, then, on which Luther set to work, a mind which concentrated on theology and philosophy, viewed man as a person rather than an individual, neglected practical sciences, and tended to accept a great deal on authority instead of learning by experiment. It was philosophical rather than scientific. It was rational and realistic rather than emotional and idealistic. And much that is good in our outlook today can be traced past Luther to the classical Christian mentality, a strong residue of which is still with us, having weathered the assaults of modern thinkers through the past 4 centuries. Luther's principal contribution to the trend of ideas was his vicious attack on human reason. His is the first successful frontal assault on the power of man's faculty of reason to guide his human actions. Man's moral responsibility for his human actions was consequently weakened, and man himself was reduced to the status of a thoroughly depraved animal who had been saved by Christ if he would trust blindly in his merits, pretty much as a collie trusts its master's decisions. Luther contributed to the justifying and the building of the absolute state, and he promoted the breakup of European unity, which, never too solid a thing, was in process of disintegration anyway. Calvin created a logically organized, legalistically briefed religion, and in doing so, he saved the Protestant movement from falling apart before a reviving Catholicism. But Calvin's biggest contribution was his glorification of the Puritan virtues, something which was accepted unquestioningly by the most influential groups in Europe and America until recently. Down till Freud's day, Calvinistic morality prevailed, except in those countries which remained morally and culturally as well as doctrinally Catholic. Calvin's glorification of business, his praise of frugality and high seriousness, his exaltation of diligent labor and social callousness contributed to the formation of the capitalist mentality and the now crumbling industrial empires of the Western world. This thing about Catholicism, think about it. Spain and Italy, they were actually the where fascism and kind of economic totalitarianism arose, probably because the Catholics were like, I'm just going to sit here and wait for Jesus. No, but it's like enjoying the fruits. They didn't do it. So, I mean, the problem with reading a book like this, the great benefit is that people like me who have a pretty sporadic education, or I'm autodidactic, like a self-educated person, I don't know everything about all these people. I still don't know everything. All I know is 30 pages each of what this guy thinks and his conclusion. So if you're interested in one of these guys, this guy makes a lot of sweeping statements about Luther, for example. If you're interested, take it and refute it or explore it or dig in more deeply. So my idea of like, is that true that the Catholic countries didn't embrace the economic thing and were left behind economically, but somehow maintain some spiritual spark? I don't know, but I'm seeing a thread here to pull on. Reinforced by Kant in the 18th century, Calvin held the field until Marx and Freud led a revolt against his individualist business ethic and his harsh code of personal morality. See, that's what you got then. You threw the baby out with the bathwater. Descartes set out to rescue reason from the skeptics, and for a time, philosophers felt that he had succeeded in reviving their weakened faith in man's ability to be a rational animal. Descartes came to be identified with rationalism, and because Cartesianism ended up a glorious, tragic failure a century later, it seemed to Western man that reason itself had failed. Descartes' failure is therefore even more important than the positive contributions he made to European thought. For had he successfully rescued reason, Locke, Kant, and Bentham would have been unnecessary. Rousseau and Freud would have been impossible. Because Descartes denied man's senses, his feeling and his emotion, their proper roles in life, men felt faced with a choice between pure reason or no reason, between being angels or animals. Descartes cut man's mind and body apart so decisively that men could no longer reconcile them, as Aristotle and the medievalists had done. They had to choose between them, and in time, men voted against their intellects in favor of their bodies. In the long run, therefore, Descartes did reason harm, and he drove it necessarily into practical sciences at the expense of social and theological speculation. Locke worked out compromises all along the line, compromises which held for a while, but in time scattered off in one direction or another, toward one extreme solution or another. He quite properly rejected Cartesian innate ideas in favor of a sensist origin of all knowledge, but his solution was framed in such terms that it could be reduced to a full idealism by Berkeley on one hand, or to an extreme sensism by Lamartine on the other. In politics, Locke defended the Glorious Revolution as a grand thing, but his defense was used to justify revolution anywhere at any time. His individualism, again, was moderate in his own hands, but it developed into the rugged individualism of the 19th century. Moderate in all things, Locke was used as the starting point for contradictory extremes of a later day in philosophy and psychology, and methodology, and the whole field of social sciences. His attitude of common sense and compromise took hold in England and America, however, to influence political and social decisions from his day till ours. Sir Isaac Newton's fame as a thinker is unequaled in the history of ideas. The goal of every influential thinker in the past 2 centuries was to become the Newton of some order or other, and the great encomium men could devise was to accord this title to their intellectual heroes. Thus, Kant flattered Rousseau by calling him the Newton of the moral order, and Kant wished to become the Newton of the philosophical order. Thus, Wallace and Huxley eulogized Darwin by calling him the Newton of the biological order. Newton was influential for his canonization of the inductive scientific method of arriving at general physical laws. He started with nothing but isolated facts which he compared and systematized and used as data for arriving at general conclusions, whereas Descartes and Leibniz deduced theories on vortices and vacuums and other things from certain basic philosophical assumptions in order to explain the phenomena of life they encountered. This Newtonian method, valuable in certain fields, came to be the method for any kind of reasoning in the 18th century. By using it, men thought they had banished mystery from the universe. By means of it, they learned much, it is true, but certain mysteries eluded them and came in time to plague their children. Newton had made science respectable, however, and he had given the scientist a place of importance alongside the philosopher and the theologian of days gone by. Rousseau is important chiefly for leading the reaction against decadent Cartesian rationalism. Luther had complained, alas, in this life, reason is never completely destroyed, and time had proved him right. But rationalists had thoroughly discredited it. In the 18th century, Rousseau undertook to destroy it, and though he was not completely successful, his anti rational influence was nevertheless both more permanent and more permeating than Luther's had been. After Rousseau, rationalists are on the defensive, largely because of him and because of the partial truths he overemphasized. Rousseau glorified feeling. He said, in effect, that man would be a good man if he would be more like an animal and less like a man. History since his day is a record of the various ways mankind has tried to put that advice into practice. It is not too happy a story. Rousseau resurrected forgotten virtues and he discovered lost truths, but the romanticism which flowed from his pen into the 19th century contained the germs of noxious growths that we tried to kill in this last desperate war. For if man follows infallible feeling, he can stray in any direction and he can go to any extreme. Nothing but brute force can check him. From Rousseau came much good as well as much that was not. For there are many fine things done under the name of humanitarianism, and the impetus toward democratic living has been a good thing. It's true, though. I mean, you can justify anything. Look at Ukraine and Syria. I mean, these are all things that people on the left under Obama for Syria and Biden were like, oh, these guys are monsters. They need to be stopped by killing everybody. It's fucking ridiculous. Kant tried to do the job Descartes had failed to do more than a century earlier. He tried to rescue philosophy by reconciling it with Newton's universe and Rousseau's heart. His attempt was ingenious, far from superficial, both adroitly and profoundly done. But Kant's solution proved even less stable than Descartes'. For where the latter made our knowledge of the outside world ultimately independent of that world and dependent on God alone, Kant went even further and made the outside world correspond to our ideas. The distinction between the phenomenal and noumenal worlds was kept in balance by Kant himself, but his followers quite naturally tipped the scales in the direction of one world or the other. Those who stressed the phenomenal world came in time to make it the only one, and within a few generations, their thought developed into pure materialism. Those who stressed the noumenal world came to deny everything else, and they ended up high in the sky of complete philosophical idealism. The Benthamites made rationalism's last stand in Western society, and a sad stand it was because Jeremy Bentham had apparently learned nothing from rationalism's failure in the 18th century. Considering Rousseau mad, he and his followers looked on man as a creature powered by pleasure and pain alone and directed by pure reason in seeking his goals. They were important because of the ancient evils they exposed and because of the reforms that followed in their wake. In the history of ideas, they are important chiefly as a transitional group between 18th century thought and that of 19th century evolutionists and socialists. Their utilitarian norm for judging the worth and rightness of anything, a typically Anglo-American standard, has lived on in its own right. It has indeed been used knowingly or unwittingly by most Englishmen and Americans ever since Bentham's day. With only a few mental twists, it developed into the philosophical pragmatism so prevalent in English-speaking countries at the present time. Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Dewey remain contemporary. Their thought is our thought. Our world is cut on their pattern. They are collectively in control of the contemporary mind, for though they have been corrected on various scientific points in their respective fields of biology, social science, and psychology, they are popularly considered the thinkers in those respective fields. Darwin stands for evolution and biology. Marx stands for communism and for the economic approach to social questions. Freud stands for psychoanalysis, and he is thought to hold the key to the secrets of the soul. Dewey stands for social engineering through education, and he is thought to hold the passport to a better world. Darwin and Marx are thoroughly materialistic. Both account for everything in terms of matter and motion. Darwin working out a system of biological determinism, and Marx a sociological system whereby everything is determined by the forces of production. Darwin reduces thought processes purely and simply to the mechanism of the brain. Marx reduces them ultimately to one's economic position. Both Darwin and Marx tried to explain all these things and solve all mysteries of life then with matter and motion alone. But their materialism differed from the 18th century variety by stressing motion rather than matter. Theirs is the historical approach. Their emphasis on change and on evolution makes it appear necessary for us to get back to the origin of things properly to understand them. It might be true, though. This is the way of men's minds today. If Descartes was guilty of using the mathematical method universally, if Kant used the Newtonian scientific method outside its proper field, we today are similarly extending the historical approach into fields where it does not rightly belong. 19th century German historicism is still too much with us, for we use it to answer questions it cannot answer. We believe that knowing the origin and development of a thing gives us full knowledge of its nature when, in fact, it gives us only historical knowledge of its growth. The historical approach throws light on almost any subject, but it cannot solve philosophical problems or unravel psychological and religious puzzles. It cannot replace analysis. Freud's emphasis, like Marx's and Darwin's, is on the historical approach. For the psychoanalyst must discover the cause of his patient's illness somewhere in the patient's infancy. The earlier, it would seem, the better. Like Marx and Darwin, moreover, Freud puts dynamism and struggle at the core of his system. These three men make struggle for survival, cutthroat competition, jungle warfare among men and nations, the only natural, indeed the inevitable kind of life. Kill or be killed is the lesson one learns from reading them. Freud stressed one point, however, which is to be found only implicitly in Darwin and Marx. This is the frontal attack on human reason, an attack as vicious as Luther's and Rousseau's, one that is more difficult to answer. For Freud resolves all apparently rational activity into compromises resulting from conflict between the ego and the id. Basically, man is only an animal for Freud, an animal who has somehow developed a little differently from his fellow animals, so that he can be neurotic. After all, Freud tells us that is the only real difference between man and the other animals. Dewey, strangely, eliminates the mind but saves intelligence. Reflective thinking for him is natural for the human organism, but it is not sharply separable from his other functions. It is his mode of participation in natural events. Dewey preserves a curious respect for the thinking animal who participates in the struggle for life by using his peculiar mode of participation, intelligence, to solve problems as they arise. But the human person is inexorably caught up in the dynamic process of life, and at best, he can only give it some slight push in the right direction. The whole course of modern intellectual history has been away from reason. Luther began by attacking it. Various attempts were made to rescue it, especially by Descartes and Kant and Bentham, but these efforts were unavailing. Other influential thinkers concentrated on the more practical matter of studying and controlling the forces of nature, and their work has been progressive. But seeing what man is made of man is the key to understanding the thought of any age. Through the past 4 centuries, man has come intellectually to have a lower and lower opinion of himself. I totally agree with that. Aristotle defined man as a rational animal, a definition which the medievalists kept intact. But moderns have had trouble with that definition ever since Luther's day. Luther emphasized the animal in man, and Calvin denied its rightful place. Descartes cut an uncrossable chasm between the rational and the animal in man, and no maker of the modern mind has thrown a bridge across that chasm. Either they have denied the animal in man in order to rescue the rational element, or they deny reason to concentrate on the animal. They never get the two together in proper relation to each other. Ironically, man has used his rational equipment in modern times to prove to himself that he is not rational. So the matter stands today in the Darwinian, Marxian, Freudian, Deweyan world. It is chasm, right? Not chasm. It's chasm. I'm trying to remember that Sting song. I think it's chasm. Section 4. The men who we chose to treat as makers of the modern mind, let us remember, are not solely responsible for the way we think today. There are countless lesser thinkers whose total contribution bulks large in the making of our mind. The full story cannot be told, for example, without including persons like Soren Kierkegaard and Karl Jaspers to explain existentialism. Fichte, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Pareto must be included to account for fascism, an important, though we can hope passing element in the modern mind. Gobineau, H.S. Chamberlain, Gunther have to be mentioned for an understanding of racism, and the whole list of German nationalist thinkers from von Treitschke to Rosenberg must be included to account for Nazism. Nor can the contemporary mind be fully described in terms of its intellectual forebears alone. Time and circumstance, the printing press and the radio, the mechanization of the world with its resulting staccato music and bustling living have all played a most important part. For they are the environment in which our minds operate, and human beings cannot think calmly or think at all, perhaps, when a radio commentator is chattering in their ears. And he sings staccato music in 1958. Holy cannoli. Even my father didn't like it. He liked the big bands. Funny. He did like Santana, but whatever. And the modern world beats at a tempo which militates against rational activity. The Industrial Revolution may not determine precisely what we think, but it has an awful lot to do with the way we think today. It has made calm contemplation almost impossible. It has made self-controlled, rational, objective thought extremely difficult. The modern world, indeed, seems to have conspired this past century against the thinking man. A conspiracy, perhaps? Men do not seem to want to think today. They would rather have their brains machine gunned by disjointed words than follow the chain of relationships established between the words of a complete sentence. Man, he is anticipating social media. The modern world just bites, sound bites, and TikTok, and the inability to read books. All younger men need do, however, is compare a paragraph from Milton with one from Sinclair Lewis or Ernest Hemingway or almost any popular contemporary writer. Or if he complains that many years have passed since Milton penned his ponderous periodic sentences, let him compare Robert Louis Stevenson's prose with that found in any slick paper magazine today. He will find that the sentence has disintegrated, which means that modern thinking has likewise disintegrated, that the business of writing is the disorganization of ideas rather than their organization into complete thoughts. Man, I guess it was started right after the war, or maybe before. 20 years ago, Wilson Follett observed that, quote, there has always been a striking incidents, never more striking than now, between our conception of the universe and our conception of the sentence. When men viewed the universe as a whole, when they tried to bring order into the world by establishing relationships between its parts, then they wrote in period sentences, then they used principal and dependent clauses. But when thought consists of a series of unrelated impressions, when men's minds operate like kaleidoscopes, then they write in disjointed sentences, one after the other. Today, it is not even necessary to write sentences. The fact that Walter Winchell's words and phrases are understood to make sense is an indictment of how we think today. A British general was reported as commenting thus on General Marshall when the latter was appointed Secretary of State, quote, good man, strange though, reads books. That is the way men's minds operate today. But fortunately, it is the way of, quote, intellectuals rather than the man in the street. This is so pregnant with what we are trying to get. Well, I try to get my mind around today. I'm like, there were thinkers, and I'm sure if you go into like the Frankfurt School, which is now, what was that article? Like the right's favorite communist, and wasn't it Gramsci or whatever? Like weird stuff. I think Courtney Turner's doing something on that. You can see that there's a top-down thing, especially through academia, to disconnect thinking. And of course, that's important if you want to control the world. This guy points out that it's the man in the street who's holding on to thinking. And of course, because he has a relationship with the physical feedback. And that's why us getting into the digiverse or being a service-oriented society is not is not good for our independence and for our thought. And it's why I think like the church is the people. Yeah, you cannot count on that stuff. But fortunately, we know what it's like to give and to need and to take with humility and to, like those love, like the practical necessity of love for human beings in the real world, Interesting. All right, the ordinary man who culturally tags a generation or two behind the intelligentsia has thus far stood up pretty well under the concerted attack made upon his mind by television, the press, and the school. He might not use Ciceronian sentences, but at least he generally uses sentences. His phlegmatic stand against the current attack on his reason suggests that Luther was correct when he complained that in this life, reason can never be completely destroyed. There are little straws in the wind, in fact, which indicate that even intellectuals are trying to recover their lost intellects. There seems less emphasis on passion and feeling today than there was a decade ago. There seems to be more discussion than formerly on questions of what is reasonable, what is right, what is prudent, what is possible in world affairs. Such things indicate that we may have passed the nadir of our intellectual history and that we might be recovering rationality. Any hope for a rationally organized world in the future, for a place where men can live as human beings instead of high-class animals, lies in men's ability again to give the rational part of their human nature its proper place in human activity. It is necessary to recover the classical Christian view of man as a rational animal. This view looks on man as a person who possesses a body with its senses, its instincts, its emotions, all of which must be given room for proper satisfaction. But they are all under rational control. It is man's reason indeed which distinguishes him from the other animals, which makes him an intelligent creature who can direct his activity according to the light of reason, and who is therefore responsible for his human activity. But there can be no return to the 13th or any other century. One would be foolish indeed simply to revive Aristotle or Cicero or St. Thomas and apply him to the 20th century as though there had never been a Darwin or a Freud or a Dewey. Thinkers of this age cannot be pre-Lutheran, pre-Cartesian, pre-Marxian, pre-anything. The contributions of all these men must be acknowledged. And where they have been proved valid, they must be incorporated into any rational system of thought. Thinkers who wish to see the universe as a rationally organized place in the future then cannot refuse to accept any established fact, whatever its source might be. Any hope for reason being given its rightful place again would be blasted by a rationalist movement such as Descartes introduced with such disastrous consequences 3 centuries ago. Such a movement would only discredit reason once again. It would be followed by another reaction such as Luther's or Rousseau's or Freud's. If man's mind is to start in a new direction in these days and to formulate a successful system of thought, it must effect a synthesis by selecting the various doctrines of its makers which have stood the test of time and have been proved valid. It must synthesize these findings by giving them proper proportion, by realizing that the simple solution is almost necessarily a wrong solution. This was the mistake of Descartes, who cut so cleanly from the past, who considered man pure mind. This was the mistake of Rousseau, who considered man nothing but unadulterated animal feeling. Of Darwin, who explained all things by struggle and survival. Of Marx, who pushed everything back to methods of production. Of Freud, who resolved everything into unconscious drives. Any such simple solution cannot explain the whole of reality. Instead, it contorts everything into its preconceived pattern to give us a caricature of reality. Not only must the true elements of each man's doctrine be rescued then, but the danger of applying a single method to all fields of thought must be avoided. This has been the mistake of most modern thinkers. Descartes thought that the mathematical deductive method would solve all life's problems, when in fact it solved only mathematical problems. Kant thought the method of the physicist would give him certainty in philosophy, and he went astray. Freud thought that the psychoanalytic approach would reveal the secrets of art and literature, history and religion, and he ended up by adding to the confusion already current in those fields. This is the mistake we must avoid today. Theorists now run the danger of explaining the mysteries of the universe and of man's soul by one of two methods which have been so fruitful of late in their respective fields, that of the historian or that of the nuclear physicist. But to tell the story of the origin and development of something is not to reveal its nature. The history of philosophy or of religion can never replace either philosophy or religion, nor can the laws of splitting atoms be applied to the disintegration of European culture today without arbitrarily creating a picture which is both unnecessary and incorrect. As no one simple law can explain complex social realities, so too no one method can be used outside its proper field without doing violence both to the theorist's mind and to the matter on which he works. It is the story of the six specialists and the elephant all over again. Like the six men from Indostan, our makers of the modern mind tended to see the whole elephant in terms of their various specialties. Descartes held the tail of mathematics and tried to describe the whole elephant in terms of that tail. Darwin grabbed the knee of evolution and reduced all things in the universe to struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. So it was with the others. None saw the universe or even man for the complex things both are. Each, as a specialist, added to the sum total of our knowledge about the elephant, but none was competent to speak about the animal as a whole, though each tried to do so. Each one told us things we did not know before, but each also added to our confusion. We must appreciate each one's contribution because it is fatal to condemn them in toto, in order to preserve our vision of the universe and of man by refusing to learn more about the two. I totally agree. You have to have an open mind. You have to have the courage to face things that challenge your truth or that are hard to comprehend. You have to, or you will be defensive and closed-minded. You have to. And trust me, if you're a good person, well-meaning person, authentic, willing to make sacrifices, have courage, then no truth can hurt you because the truth is good, I think. And I think the very concepts of Level and Plum prove that order is good, truth is objective. Anyway, those who think on philosophical, historical, or social problems today, those who hope to guide the future course of events by their thinking and their writing, can profit from the mistakes of the makers of the modern mind we have discussed in this book. Thinkers today can profit too from the many areas of thought thinkers of the past have explored for us, for they have discovered much. Each one has made a positive contribution to our fund of human knowledge, and each has made his mistakes. Neither their discoveries nor their mistakes need have been made in vain if we utilize their positive contributions to our knowledge, overlooking none of them, and if we are conscious of their errors, repeating none of them in the future. Well, thank you, Thomas P. Neal, PhD, for this book, Makers of the Modern Mind. He obviously put a lot. Oh, you know what I'll do right now? Because we have a little extra time. Let me get his biography. I found a biography of him, and it was kind of interesting. Here we go. Sorry. La, la, la. All right, here we go. Here's a biography of this guy. Why not, right? Why not? Thomas P. Neal. Okay, when was this written? Probably around the time. I don't know. Anyway, Thomas P. Neal. If birth and early childhood have a determining influence on one's later life, as it is popularly held, then I should have been born a writer of Western fiction. So I guess this is himself speaking, autobiographical. It's just one page. For I was born in 1915 in a mining town on the Continental Divide in Colorado. Not much later, the Prohibition Amendment became part of the law of the land, but apparently not in Telluride, Colorado, because my earliest memories are of busy places on Main Street, which I was told were saloons, and of our neighbors having truckloads of grapes delivered to make jelly. These same neighbors, I remember, had the only effective remedy for the flu, mysterious ingredients dissolved in a tall glass of hot wine. Saloon, like as in salon, or saloons like, was that a euphemism? Anyway, I was the oldest of 4 children, and by the time I was in the 4th grade, my parents decided to move to a more civilized community, quote, where we could grow up in the faith, capital F. From Telluride, I took certain impressions that have never been erased. A rough pagan society where charity abounded, although the word was probably unknown. A society I have always contrasted to more sophisticated communities to underscore the advantages and the shortcomings of the latter. Through the next 4 years, we moved frequently. I attended something like a dozen grade schools, public and parochial, and cannot remember any great differences among them, except that in some you stood up to recite and in others you sat down. But I did learn some geography, and I came to know that the Irish in South Chicago were quite different from the Mormons in Utah. Eventually, our family settled in St. Louis, where I attended high school and college. These 8 years were the period of the Great Depression, which turned young people's minds to social thought and inclined them to believe that the industrialists who had built America had somehow pulled a great hoax on the people. I wonder if that was like being in high school during COVID, as far as, something that the powers that be that instituted that drew upon. Excuse me. St. Louis was and is a conservative city, not aggressive like Detroit or hurried like Chicago. St. Louisans find time to read and to cultivate the vanishing art of conversation. I therefore spent my years of study in a society that is quietly cultured, where young people gather in each other's homes rather than in clubs, where I frequently found myself discussing Plato with a friend's lawyer father or St. Thomas with a banker. In such surroundings, it is natural for a young man to turn to things academic and to want to stay with them as long as possible before taking up some pedestrian occupation. Sometimes I think it is good to drift for a while. Rushing to a destination is never good if the destination is wrong, for one either ends up in the wrong place or else spends several years retracing his steps. At any rate, I kept open all the avenues I might follow: journalism, civil service, personal work, and I forget what others. A scholarship to do master's work at Notre Dame presented itself, and then a fellowship for doctoral work at St. Louis University. In each case, the work was its own reward, and eventually I found myself an instructor in modern European history with the opportunity of exploring with graduate students whatever realms of intellectual, cultural, and social history deserved exploration. I had drifted into the profession of reading, teaching, and writing. A man is supposed to know what influences, in the form of books and men, whetted his appetite, formed his attitudes, and shaped his mind when he was growing up. I know the books I read, the men who taught me, and the fellow students who influenced me one way or the other, but to isolate the contribution of each is impossible. The Catholic revival, quote, was much talked about in those days. Students almost had to read Chesterton, Belloc, Hollis, Gill, and the others, and then they had to wonder why there were not comparable American Catholic writers. My mother always referred to that, and my aunts and stuff, those writers, definitely Belloc and Chesterton. I shall never know. I think Hilaire Belloc was the one who said, "Beware false hope." So my aunt wouldn't like Ron Paul. And I was like, that's not the false hope. Now I went, well, she's dead, but I wonder what she would have thought of our current situation. I shall never know whether the teachers who stimulated me or those who repelled me were the most influential. As a whole, though, they opened up for me a centuries-old tradition of learning the intellectual and cultural past of Christendom. It was natural for me to undertake independent explorations of this rich tradition and, on occasion, as a citizen, to apply this wisdom to contemporary problems. It was also natural in time for me to make a few small contributions of my own to this stream of thought. Somewhere along the line, I began to write for publication. Just when or how, I do not remember, but I do remember writing small bits of high school news for the local newspapers. In college, ambitious students can write longer bits for the student newspaper, which I did, and even editorials when one has somehow acquired a reputation among undergraduates as a critical thinker. St. Louis University had a respectable literary quarterly when I was a student. It served as a vehicle for undergraduate literary effort, a testing ground for style, and an experimental plant for daring ideas. It also served to discover and develop the writing talents of several undergraduates. Here I published articles on various subjects and in varying veins. Here too I learned not to write satire unless the label satire is put under the title. Some of these articles showed up as reprints, and each such occasion confirmed my suspicion that I might have that mysterious thing referred to in the writers' school advertisements as talent. These were lean but good years, sitting around with fellow students, arguing, discussing, settling world problems, ignoring the passage of time. This is the closest approach we Americans have to the Academy of Athens and the Scholars Club of more recent times. Wit sharpens in clash with other wits. Thinking is refined, generalizations are qualified, and each disputant is driven to read the ancient masters and the modern experts in order to bring more ammunition to the next verbal battle. Out of such groups, I suspect writers do emerge, but teaching and scholarly pursuits precluded any serious thought on my part of a writing career. Almost every article and book I've had published since 1939 was born in the classroom or on the lecture platform. They were all written versions of previously given lectures. This has its advantages and disadvantages. It makes for colloquial style, for a wordiness and looseness foreign to fine writing, but it helps one achieve what I consider the purpose of writing, the communication of one's knowledge and judgments to the reader, just as the speaker communicates to his listeners if he is a good speaker. It centers the writer's attention on the reader and the message rather than on the style. Writing, then, has been for me another form of teaching and of academic conversation. It is not a hobby because it is hard work, and it is not rewarded as oral communication is by seeing how the reader is affected. It is not a hobby, moreover, because it is so closely connected with my professional work as a teacher that it can never be done on the side or in spare time. I see only two reasons for enduring the drudgery of writing. The first is to communicate one's convictions to a wider audience than one can assemble in a classroom. The second is to make money. A professor in a Catholic university obviously writes for both reasons. Professors can write three kinds of books or articles, excluding literature in the technical sense: scholarly works, popular works, and textbooks. All three are legitimate, I submit, and all three are necessary. Scholarly work is easy to do, and it is absorbingly interesting. Popularization is difficult, and it is generally badly done, because it requires of the author both the knowledge of the scholar and the human sensitivity of the politician. Good textbooks are the hardest of all to do well, and they are the most poorly done because there are so few men or women who combine scholarly knowledge and pedagogical skill with the ability to write accurately and interestingly. I have tried all three kinds of writing, and only the reader knows with what degree of success or failure. In 1941, I married Agnes Weber of Denver, Colorado. Few of my colleagues have been so fortunate in having a wife who understands what a professor writer must do to make a mark in his profession, who are willing to give so generously and ask nothing in return. We have 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls, who at this moment are in 5 different schools. The modern world seems to have conspired against large families, and despite their teaching to the contrary, Catholic organizations are a party to the conspiracy. Yes, that's absolutely true. And I wonder how his children worked out, because my parents were younger than this guy, but they had 9 kids. They weren't finished having kids until much later than this guy. But the older ones fell by the wayside. I wonder if this guy's younger ones did. If my wife and I had 1 or 2 children, we could perhaps meet the demands made upon us by fathers and mothers clubs, parish associations, Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, young ladies social societies, and a host of other organizations insistently demanding our presence 7 or more evenings each week. We find that with 9 children, we must restrict ourselves to maintaining a single organization, our family, which is in session 24 hours a day, run democratically on one occasion and dictatorially on another, but where we like to think that charity abounds and good fruit will be produced. We consider ourselves fortunate to live in the years when the church in America is achieving maturity. It was formerly the church of the immigrants, and it tried to minister to these foreign Americans and to see that they keep the faith. See, this new pope, if he wants to champion the immigrant thing, he should take this angle. But don't tell him, because I question if it would be exploited for ill purposes. It succeeded in this task because of the heroic work of our grandfathers, but in the process, it developed an unhealthy minority context, which we of this generation must dissolve. Actually, the real answer, and I learned it from a Peruvian missionary like our Pope was, if you're worried about immigration, figure out why they're leaving their homes. And I would say our foreign policy contributes to a lot of it. So criticize that and don't, whatever, blah, blah, blah. The church in America has moved from the social apostolate to the intellectual and spiritual apostolates, and my wife and I consider ourselves privileged to play a small role in developing these new apostolates. This, we think, will be done by the provincial concomitants of many things, by dedicating to God and by raising in the faith a large family, by prayer and by playing a part in directing parish activity in the right direction, by seeking the truth in one's professional work, and by disseminating it, which in some small way leads to ultimate truth and to the glory of God, and by doing what we can to spread through American society the light which enkindles the world and is the sole source of hope that our children can honestly thank us for having brought them into the world and having done something to make it a habitable place for the children of God. Interesting. Editor's note: Dr. Neal's books include Weapons for Peace, Makers of the Modern Mind, They Lived the Faith, Religion and Culture, The Rise and Decline of Liberalism. I don't know what he means by that. The old one or the new one. And in collaboration with Dr. Raymond Cement, History of the Church. Well, there you go. That was an enjoyable experience, and thank you for joining me.